Today we will be reviewing what is quite possibly the ultimate emulation machine. The device is called the GPD-XD, and before we get started, a big thanks must go to GearBest for sending me the 32GB variant to review. So, let's start with the build quality. Now, something you will immediately notice is that this strongly resembles the second generation of Nintendo's 3DS XL. I actually have that very 3DS XL right here for comparison purposes, and yeah, it looks exactly like the 3DS, until you open it up and then you start to notice some notable differences. The most obvious being that instead of a second screen, you get some extra controls. So you have two analog sticks and they are very comfortable to use. The best way to describe how they feel is that they are very similar in movement and fluidity as the sticks that are found on the PS Vita. They are just ever so slightly bigger on the GPD-XD, but other than that, they are pretty much identical. Also, right besides them, we have L3 and R3 buttons as the analog sticks don't press in. The D-pad is pretty terrible. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, it's serviceable, but it's not very tactile. It doesn't have much definite action, and it has this cheap and unpleasant glossy coating which feels out of place and wrong. And then we have the face buttons, which are very tactile and overall great. The only slight quibble I have with them is that they could have done with a bit more travel, but that's a very small nitpick. We also have micro-switched shoulder buttons, and then we have the function keys, which consist of your volume controls, your power on-off, multitasking UI, and a gamepad customization button which allows you to alter and personalize the controls for Android games, which I will demonstrate to you later. You also have your start and select buttons, which, annoyingly enough, are on the lower left rather than the traditional opposing right-hand side. And to this day, that still gets me when I'm playing games. Terrible, terrible placement which confuses me immensely. And finally, we have a back and home button, as this is essentially a mini Android tablet with a controller stuck on and simplified. And as we move to the end of the hardware, we have the screen. The screen is a 5-inch IPS display and it is running at a resolution of 1280 by 720. And something that this has over the 3DS is that the top screen is also a touch screen. So you can either use the integrated controls to navigate around the operating system or just reach out and touch the screen. Also, with regards to ports and expandability, we have a micro SD card slot, a mini HDMI and micro USB port, as well as a headphone jack. The only problem I have with the hardware is that the opening and closing clamshell aesthetic could have been executed better. Now, the 3DS has a fairly intuitive and secure closing mechanism, as there are protruding rubber pads that make contact with the base as it closes. The GPD-XD tries to incorporate the same system, but with much less success. So, enough talking about the device, let's see it run some games. So I'm going to start with fairly basic emulators and we'll gradually move on to more intensive ones. So let's start with NES emulation. Not particularly difficult, so I'll cover this one quickly. Every NES game I've played on this device runs perfectly. Super Mario Bros. 3, as you can see, is running flawlessly, and the sound reproduction is also spot on. So yeah, I've had nothing but great results every time I've booted up NES games on this device, but that being said, you'd expect it to run NES games perfectly. If it struggled, then we would be in trouble. Next up is Super Nintendo emulation, and this was downright perfect. There were no graphical problems, no audio errors, and the games played exactly like they were supposed to. However, there is one big, glaring problem with Super Nintendo emulation, and that is the controls. The position of the A, B, Y, and X buttons have been reversed, and that means controlling games for any of the Nintendo platforms is also reversed, and that makes playing them feel odd. I tried to get used to the reversed button layout, but I just couldn't. So this is actually a design flaw on the GPD-XD as a whole. Now, there are ways to rectify this issue, but doing so does take away from the convenience and ease of use that this device is so eagerly pushing. So yeah, that is a big problem. But if you don't mind this issue or can find a way to rectify it, then you will have no problems playing your Super Nintendo games on the move, as they run absolutely perfectly. My best advice to you though is to get the SNES 9X emulator, as it fixes the inverted controls. Next up is Game Boy Advance emulation. Again, not particularly difficult for the system to run, but it's something that you would want to play on a Nintendo-looking device such as this. And as you would expect, all Game Boy Advance games run absolutely flawlessly. I particularly loved playing TMNT, as it's one of my favourite beat-em-ups for the platform. Anyway, moving on, it's time to take a look at MAME emulation. Now, I have little to no knowledge on good games for this platform, so I asked someone who did know, and we actually had some quite good fun playing Bomb Jack and Outzone. And both games, as well as other less impressive titles, played really well. It does take some preparation to set some of these games up though. Outzone in particular was a real pain in the butt to get working, so you are gonna have to occasionally use a few brain cells to get games working on this emulator. But overall, MAME emulation works fine. Next up, it's time for some N64 emulation. Now, the Nintendo 64 game that I wanted to play the most was GoldenEye, and to the device's credit, it runs fine, for the most part, but the main problem is in the way it handles the controls. Now, the controls for GoldenEye are inalterable, and as a result, the game is completely unplayable. I mean, if you love to play your first-person shooters with the select button triggering your firearm, then by all means this is for you. But for the rest of us, this renders the game unplayable. And it's a shame, because the game is running at a more than playable frame rate and the sound is on point, but what ultimately renders it useless is the controls. So I then decided to install a different emulator, and although this did fix the controls, it introduced a couple of different problems. First of all, there is a solid 2-second audio delay, so the sound is out of sync with what's going on. And the second problem is that the emulation, although passable, is more glitchy. But yeah, GoldenEye doesn't particularly work too well, which is a shame as it's my favourite game for the platform. I even tried to get Blast Core to run, but that wouldn't even load the main menu. So N64 emulation is hit and miss. There are several games that are preloaded in the device and they work really well, but I would advise that you be careful as other N64 titles can be susceptible to similar control flaws as GoldenEye. But there are several other games that aren't hindered by this deficiency, so you should have a great time, but be wary that Nintendo 64 emulation, although great 60% of the time, it's very shaky the other 40%. Now it's time for PlayStation 1 emulation, and I can hardly fault this at all. Literally every PS1 game I've thrown at the device has worked perfectly. Sometimes you might have to fiddle with the emulation settings to make it run at a perfect frame rate, but even if you don't, the games are still perfectly playable and a lot of fun. However, I will say, when I was playing Tekken 3, which is one of the more intensive PS1 games, the sound was out of sync by about half a second. Now that may not sound like a lot, but with fighting games, the sound needs to be 100% on point with your moves, otherwise it does take away from the impact and satisfaction of the hits. It also skips a couple of sound effects, but other than that, Tekken 3 plays fine. Less intensive PS1 games such as Raiden and The Simpsons Wrestling work very well too and have no graphical or audio problems at all. So overall, I can confidently say that PlayStation emulation is a success. Now we move on to the most interesting and sophisticated of systems for the handheld to emulate, Dreamcast emulation. Now I was expecting the Dreamcast emulator to be completely and utterly useless, as Dreamcast emulation on devices such as this have been quite unsuccessful to say the least. But to my genuine surprise, the emulator works spectacularly well. I mean seriously, far more games than I expected worked with minimal graphical and emulation problems, and they were more than playable. And this really is a big win for this handheld, as you can now preload and take a ton of Dreamcast games with you on the move on a tiny little portable device like this. And it works a treat. Amazing. Never would have expected it. And finally, it's time to take a quick look at how it plays the usual Android games from the Play Store. And I immediately downloaded the first couple of games that I saw to quickly test this out. The first one is Powerpuff Girls. Now the reason I picked this game is because it has gamepad support, so it automatically detects the integrated controls. And it works wonderfully. A game like this would be a complete and utter chore to play through using touchscreen controls, but with physical controls, you can comfortably play for prolonged periods of time as opposed to a couple of minutes. The game, however, sucks. Don't download it. If you want to play an in-depth side-scrolling game with a variety of power-ups, well, this game completely deprives them from you right from the start. And when you do start to acquire them over time, they are so boring. So yeah, this game had a lot of potential to be a great side-scroller, but it made all the wrong decisions. Avoid at all costs. Even though it didn't cost anything. The other mobile game is one of my own personal favourites that I haven't played in years. Now this game does not support any gamepads, however, there is a workaround with the GPD XD. All you do is press the gamepad button, which I alluded to earlier, and then you place these control diagrams, such as the analog sticks, to the corresponding on-screen buttons. Hit save, and like magic, you are now able to control your mobile games with physical controls. This really is an invaluable feature of the GPD XD. You can't do this with other Android emulation consoles, so this definitely gives the GPD XD extra points. It goes even further as well, as you can use the same method to control regular apps, such as YouTube, and it works as you would expect. So there we have it, that is the GPD XD, a cheap Android device with vastly superior emulation capabilities to pretty much everything else on the market. I mean really, I dare you to find a portable emulation device that runs Android and supports the vast majority of emulators that this thing does, all whilst giving you 6 to 8 hours of battery life. If portable emulation is what you're looking for, then you should look no further than right here. I am proud to award the GPD XD a very strong 8 out of 10. Also, some additional information, the handheld does have stereo speakers and they are great for watching YouTube videos, but I tell ya, they really come into their own when they're outputting audio from the emulators. Now, there is another device that is very similar to this called the GPD Win, and what's very interesting about it is that it runs Windows 10 and supports full-blown PC games. And I intend to review this device next, so stay tuned and we'll see just how well this handheld computer performs. Anyway, that's it for another review, guys. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe to my channel. It's free for you and good for me. And for those of you who are wondering, don't worry, I have more versus videos on the way, including Justice League versus the Avengers, so you can have that to look forward to. Thanks again for watching, guys, and I will catch all of you next time. Take care.